Madison County Public Libraries. I hope you're having a good day. We're here for our next episode of Spice Club, talking about different spices and different uses for those spices. So the star of the show this time is sage. Now, we're just coming off of Thanksgiving season, so most of you probably have sage at your house right now. And if you're like most people, you know to use sage on your turkey. Maybe you put a little in your stuffing, and then that jar sits around for most of the rest of the year till Thanksgiving comes around, and you maybe just go ahead and buy another one. If you're like certain members of my family, a little poke into their cabinets found 5 jars of sage. I think I could have supplied you with your samples straight out of that cabinet. But a funny thing about that, sage has one of the shorter shelf lives of a lot of spice. So if you buy that one at Thanksgiving time, or whenever you might decide to do it, or when you pick up a sample at the library, you should use it as soon as possible. It doesn't last more than a year. So if you've accumulated 5 in your cabinet, it's time for them to find a new location. But sage is a spice that comes out of the Mediterranean region, but it's not a spice you would typically associate with that region. We've talked about a few of those, but that's where it originally grew, and it was used medicinally more than for a cooking spice. As a cooking spice, that happened more as that spice traveled the country and found its way to us. I think sage tastes great with a lot of different vegetables, and so today we're going to highlight a butternut squash lasagna dish, which is not a typical lasagna. I am going to prepare it vegetarian, but if you were my husband at home, he would say just add sausage to that and it would be perfect. So let's take a quick look at our ingredients, and then I need to get some of them into the oven because some roasting is needed to happen. So as I said, the main ingredient is butternut squash, and if you know me, you know I like to do little shortcuts. So I bought already cubed butternut squash to sort of speed this process. There is spinach in there. The recipe originally called for frozen spinach. I like the taste of fresh better, and when you have frozen spinach, you have to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze all the water out of it prior to being able to use it, or you're going to end up with a soggy dish. So I took a package of spinach and then just did a coarse chop of it. And you'll see the percentages of the spinach to the squash are about the same. I have a chopped onion here, and then I've got cloves of garlic that are going to get roasted in with the squash. So the squash, the onions, and the garlic, and the sage will be going together into the oven to roast. We have several cheeses in this dish. So I have ricotta cheese, I have Parmesan cheese, I have mozzarella cheese. Now all those things probably seem pretty typical for lasagna, but the other addition I have is goat cheese. A lot of times you have to look closely for it to be labeled. It's labeled chèvre, which is the French word for goat cheese. I knew that, and so I could find it. It's often kind of near where feta and some of those coarse ground cheeses might be. Other ingredients, I've got a little olive oil for my roasting pan, a little crushed red pepper that I like to sprinkle just to give the slightest bit of heat, sage obviously, and then we're going to use oven-ready lasagna noodles. Recipes that talk about no-bake lasagna, or no-boil lasagna, sorry, noodles, that's what we're talking about. And again, that's just trying to reduce some of that moisture. If your lasagna gets super, super wet, it usually has to sit and rest for a while before you can cut into it. And you'll know if you've had an issue of that because you'll cut it and all of the cheese tends to kind of pool around that slice. It still tastes good. It's not terribly pretty. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to do a quick drizzle of our olive oil onto a cookie sheet. This butternut squash needs to roast for about 30 minutes. And so I'm going to go ahead and get that started. We won't chat for 30 minutes, but I want to get it going. I'm going to dump my entire package of that on there and just try and spread it out to essentially be a flat layer. That gives you those little crispy edges that are so nice. I have some chopped onion, and I'm putting that in there too. And then the garlic is going to go in whole cloves, which look like that. that'll give a nice roasted garlic smell and taste. If I put it in chopped form, which is most often how I use it at my house, it would burn in the oven. Those little tiny pieces wouldn't be able to take that oven temperature for the amount of time it needs to be in there. And then all these tasty bits are going to get processed together to be a single filling. So let me pop those in there. All right, and I'm going to give a little shake of my sage over the top. Now, sage is very nice in its fresh form. You'll see the leaves look kind of fuzzy and soft, like almost like a little bunny's ear or something like that. Sage in its dried form comes two ways. You can get what's called rub sage, which is what I have here, that they literally dry and then rub the sage into smaller bits and all. And then there's ground sage. Now, ground or powdered sage it has a very strong flavor. It's actually not a very nice flavor. If you've got ground sage in your pantry, I would go ahead, maybe think about retiring that and pick up your sample of rub sage from the library, which has a much more close to nature sort of flavor to it. So I'm gonna give one last, and I put about, I like the sage with this. I've put what would equal about 3 teaspoons worth of sage onto my roasting pan. And then I'm going to do just a little shake of this crushed red pepper. Don't go crazy with that. You're not looking for it to be spicy. But just a little shake on there. So I'm going to pop that in the oven here, and I'll be back in just a moment. All right, well, now that we have the squash roasting in the oven, it's going to be in there for about 20 minutes. Could go as much as 30 if it is more of a winter squash and a little firmer, but we're going to roast it until the squash is fairly soft and the onions have softened a little bit, and that'll all get processed together to be a single filling. So to make good use of our time while we're here, we're going to go ahead and make our cheese layer. So we're going to mix in first all of my goat cheese. So these are each 4-ounce containers, and you need 8 ounces in here. So this is kind of the cheese star of the show that we've got going on here. So I'm going to pop that in there. All right. We have a single small container of ricotta cheese. Now, I like to buy whole milk ricotta cheese. You can buy it skim, and I know we like to think slim. That's my oven telling me it's fully preheated. But the whole milk ricotta has a much more full flavor. And I think if you're eating lasagna, hopefully you're not counting calories too closely anyway. So I'm going to pop that in there as well. Give it a squeeze. There we go. My spinach is going in. The recipe again calls for defrosted spinach. And I'm looking at this and I'm going to give it just a little bit of a coarse cut. There's in some ways nothing less pleasant than biting into your spinach and you pull out this huge piece. So I see a few larger pieces in there. I was not very tidy in my chopping, so let me take care of that just real quick while we're here. But you're looking for the full flavor of it, but again, not huge pieces that you're going to be pulling out. And I also make sure to look and pull out any stems that I see. They cook down fairly soft, but again, lasagna tends to have kind of an even texture. So having everything somewhat uniform, if that makes sense, is always a good idea. So I eyeballed a couple big pieces in there and I thought, okay, let me just go ahead and take care of that. So my pieces are much more now kind of in this small fork size in here. So I'm going to dump that into my bowl. Bring that back over here. There we go. So if you chose to use frozen spinach, you would have defrosted it, and as I said, you would have really squeezed out as much liquid as you can. Usually if I do that, I put it into a colander with paper towels in the bottom, and I press and press and press, and you almost really have to do it until no more liquid comes out. I'm being lazy, but I also like the taste of the fresh one here. We're going to put in some Parmesan cheese. And it actually calls for a full cup, so I'm just going to measure 2 half cups in here. A little more won't hurt, but you know what I mean. cup is about this whole container. I have the tiniest bit left, don't look, there, and it went right in. I don't see any sense in hanging on to that tiny amount. So those are in there, and now we're going to put in our sage. If you're using fresh sage, you're going to put in about 2 tablespoons. With a dried sage, even a nice rubbed sage like this, you're going to use less. A dried spice has always got a stronger flavor, and you don't want it to be overwhelming. Sage has a pretty strong flavor. So where you might use 2 to 3 tablespoons of a chopped fresh sage, we're going to do about 1.5 teaspoons of this rubbed sage to get it in there. I tend to measure in my hand, not using a measuring spoon. And we're going to give this big sticky mess all a stir here. The ricotta kind of provides the moisture for this, and the goat cheese remains in a fairly chunky form. You can buy goat cheese in logs, or you can find it crumbled. I bought the crumbled so it distributes a little better throughout, because it's the other kind of featured flavor. We're really focused on the butternut squash, goat cheese, and obviously the sage together. So we give this a good stir. Again, we want it fairly well combined. A lot of these cheeses have a fairly strong salty flavor. If I were doing just ricotta by itself, I would probably pretty heavily salt and pepper it. But given the salt content of the other 2 cheeses, I would normally be tasting this and checking to see if it needs it. And because I've made this, I know it really doesn't require a lot. If salt is more to your taste, then you might opt to do a little sprinkle into this mixture. So it's fairly well combined, and it's going to be somewhat spreadable. So as you think of us doing our assembly, we're going to assemble this much like we would do any other lasagna, and we'll have the butternut squash, we'll have the cheese, and we actually are using a marinara sauce. I think as I went through the ingredients, I didn't really touch on that. A marinara is typically a little thinner than other tomato sauces that you might purchase. If you make it homemade, absolutely do it. I can my own tomatoes and I would do that, but we're at the end of the season and I'm saving for winter. But I bought just kind of a generic marinara. It'll go on the bottom, and that liquid is important because otherwise those no-boil noodles don't have any moisture to absorb, and then you'll end up with kind of a dry, firm noodle, which is not a very nice taste. So I've got my cheese mixture, and I'll just kind of tip it and show it forward to you so you can see everything's kind of mixed in together. And so we're in a little bit of a holding pattern. We're going to wait on that butternut squash to roast, and then we're going to process it. I'm not cooking in my own kitchen, and so I don't have my food processor here. So what I'm going to do is just mash it. Any of the big pieces, I'll give a coarse chop and then mash it down to an equally spreadable consistency. But we'll get it back together as soon as this comes out of the oven and take a quick look. So I'll see you in a few minutes. Alright, so we've given our squash enough time to roast with the onions and the garlic. Got a little bit of sage in there because of course we're trying to feature that little bit of a flavor. I took a pinch of it as I was mashing it, and I added just a little bit of salt and pepper, that it needed just a hint of that. As I mentioned, I did not bring my food processor, which means it's no problem if you don't own one. It just took a little elbow work of chopping to get it to a fairly smooth consistency. So we're going to go ahead and build our lasagna. So while I was waiting, I gave my pan just a quick spray of oil just to, cheeses tend to try and stick. And we're going to now go ahead and lay our oven-ready lasagna noodles in there. And in my pan, it looks like I can do 4 across. Oops, I'm trying to get ahead of myself. First, splash a little marinara sauce. We had that whole conversation about need a little sauce in there for it to absorb. So I'm pouring a small amount into the bottom, and I'm just going to give it kind of a shake to firmly coat the bottom of the pan. And because I've oiled it, it's sloshing around a little bit, so I'm going to add a wee bit more in there. Use my spatula to spread it, maybe. But the noodles need a little of this moisture to soften themselves. That's the trick with the no-bake noodles. Now, I mean no boil noodles, I want to call it that. The other option that you can do is go ahead and boil the lasagna noodles, and if that's what you have at home, totally works. Boil them, just make sure they're real dry as they go into the pan so that they don't take away from your dish. Again, we don't want to add too much moisture. So I'm going to lay 4 noodles in the bottom of my pan, and it's a little bit short, and so I'm going to take a 5th noodle and just break off the end of it and then lay it in my pan to just cover that in. We want the most of this tasty lasagna goodness. All right, and so we're going to start layering. So we've got noodles. We're going to put our squash in next. And we're going to have 2 layers, so I know that that means I'm going to put about half of my squash in there. Spatula works real well for spreading it around, and I just sort of divided it on my pan so I could portion that out fairly easily. So it's not a real thick layer. Smells nice with the garlic in there. Get that kind of locked in there in big sections, and then I'll spread it out. All right, so that's about half of it. And I'm just gonna loosely spread that into kind of a thin mixture on top of the noodles. So we go noodles and then squash. When I make lasagna, I find I'm often talking to myself to make sure I don't forget a layer when I'm in there. I don't know if you do that, but that typically happens to me. So spreading that around just a little bit to get good flavor in every bite. Again, that squash is kind of the feature, so we want to make sure there's plenty. Spread on top. Perfect. Again, that's given a little bit of moisture into those noodles, so we want to make sure it's there doing its job. All right. Okay, next comes the cheeses. So this is the cheeses with the spinach that we mixed up. Same thing, I'm going to take a look and I'm going to do half of it. Okay? And you just kind of do big blobs in there. Chunky things like this are a challenge to spread, so you do as much as you can as far as doing drops within the pan, and then you can again use your spoon or your spatula to spread it out some, because you want some of that good flavor in every bite. And the recipe recommends putting marinara sauce on top of this. I'm going to take a look and see how that's going to do. Otherwise, I may opt to put the marinara sauce on top of the noodles, but we'll give it a go in the way that the recipe describes it, and I'll let you know if that turns into the sticky mess I'm afraid it might. All right, so we're spreading that out a little bit. Use the back of my spoon to do that. And again, just trying to get a little of that flavor into every bite. Dropping it makes it easier to spread around. I think we'll be able to get the marinara on top without it being too messy. But as I said, the trick with lasagna is a lot of it has a nice smooth consistency. So even though we have vegetables in here, we want them to, be in a softer consistency, not chunky. Now when I put meatballs in it, obviously that's different. If I put meat in here, I'd be looking for a different texture. But overall, we're just aiming for a nice, smooth lasagna. All right. One little scoop that I missed in there. And a little in the corner. That bit of layer is pretty important. There we go. All right, so I'm going to take my jar and I'm going to do just that same little drizzle of marinara sauce again. Just trying to offer a little moisture for those noodles so they don't suck it all out of the cheese. So just doing it in big drops. Fortunately, I can't really tip my pan and show it to you. I've not mastered having the camera right above to be able to do it. So I'm going to now put another layer of noodles. And as I said, you're just stacking right on top. And I'm pressing it in just to create sort of a firm layer. Alright, and one for the bottom. And I pre-broke one of them there just to test. Alright, so talking to myself again. Next is squash. Again, just flopping it around in there so we get a little of that flavor in every bite. missed. There we go. All right, I'll hold the pan over it and do it correctly. Last little bit. Okay, so we've used all the spinach, and again, using my spatula to give it a good spread around, because this is the layer on top of those noodles. So we want to make sure they're fully covered. Don't want to have dry, crunchy noodles in the middle of our lasagna. That'd be terrible. Spread that out real good. More on one side than the other. I have to do a little doctoring here. Here we go. Kind of like a thick paste that I'm spreading around. All right. So we're going to do what we did, and we're going to do just droplets of the goat cheese and ricotta cheese together, trying to get that easily spreadable throughout our lasagna. And into this layer, I'm going to add some grated cheese. So I've got mozzarella and I've got some grated Parmesan. So I'm going to start layering that. And then of course, like most lasagnas, we're going to finish up with those grated cheeses on the top. Cheeses in here. There we go. Get that last couple bites. Don't want any of it to go to waste. All right. Again, I'm going to give it a little spread around because we want that flavor throughout. The goal too is just to make sure you're not seeing that noodle anywhere in there. Spread and make sure you've got a good coating on top of it. Having to use my finger to help because it's pretty thick. Doing a quick check because like I said, I want to make sure I'm not seeing any noodle, even on the edges. So use your spoon and kind of tuck your filling around on top if you need to make sure those noodles are covered. All right, so I've got mozzarella cheese and I'm going to do a pretty hefty little coating on top there. And I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of the Romano or Parmesan, whichever you purchased, on top as well, just to give it that nice bite. That's a pretty salty cheese and it tastes pretty nice in there. All right, I'm going to do just a little shake of that on top. Starting to look like a lasagna. There we go. All right, and then again, we're going to do that marinara sauce. Shaking it on top. We're going to do our last layer of noodles. So take it, press it in there good. So in your final layer, you're just adding the last of your marinara sauce. And this time you really want to make sure those noodles are covered. Crunchy noodles are not a happy noodle in a lasagna. Now, The first time you make this, if you're not sure on quantities, you'll notice I have a second jar. I decided I might need a backup plan just in case, because the first time I make any recipe, I'm never 100% on the quantity. And this recipe did not provide a good measure on that. So I bought a second jar knowing if I didn't need it, I certainly can use it another time, but I have it here. But I feel like I'm in good shape as far as using one jar and spread that over the top of this. Really depends on the size of your pan. I used a 9x13. If you use something bigger or you try to squeeze in an extra layer or something like that, you might decide you need just that little bit more marinara sauce. But I think I'm in good shape here. Okay, we're going to do again mozzarella cheese on top and pecorino romano or parmesan. I try not to do such a thick layer of cheese that it feels thick like a noodle itself, but I do like to get it fully coated. And I'm going to do just the smallest sprinkle of the sage on top. Don't go crazy with it because it's a strong spice and it'll overwhelm some of the other flavors. All right, so good amount there. We get a little dusting of our Parmesan again. Sometimes the Parmesan crisps a little bit in the oven and that gives it sort of a nice little texture. Very enjoyable. Alright. And then I'm going to do just a pinch of the sage just to add a little herby flavor on top. And this will get covered and it goes in the oven for 30 minutes. You'll uncover it, let it cook for about another 10. We cover it because it tends to almost be a steaming process with the noodles. And then we uncover it because it's nice when the cheese is melty and brown. All right, so this is ready to go in the oven and we'll be back when it's time to do our slicing and take a look at how this looks. All right, so I'll see you in about 40 minutes. All right, well, we're back and our lasagna has spent 40 minutes in the oven and then I let it rest for about 10 minutes because as I told you, you want to let it sit so that that cheese doesn't pool on the plate. So I've got a nice slice here. I'll move it just a little bit, a little closer for you to take a look at. You can see it's not moving around too much. And in my pan, try not to burn my fingers while I do this, you can see that there's not a lot of excess moisture from cutting my slice out of there. And that's what you want. You want to let it rest long enough so that the cheese is set. So that's it on our butternut squash sage goat cheese lasagna that we made. I hope that you enjoy it, and I've included 2 other recipes to help use up that sage that you either picked up from us or that you have hiding in your cupboard since Thanksgiving. I hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.